Hey, it's Scott Bertram, and I've got a challenge for you today. Become a better educated American citizen. And to help you do just that, we at Hillsdale College have our free online courses available for all who wish to learn. Our challenge? Take just one of our courses. There are so many to choose from. You can discover the beauty of the Bible in the Genesis story, study the writings of C.S. Lewis, or explore the true meaning of America in Constitution 101. We have dozens more to choose from, and all these self-paced free courses feature Hillsdale faculty and scholars, many you've heard on this podcast. So visit hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE, and pick one of the more than 30 free Hillsdale courses. I hope you'll accept my challenge. Pick whichever course you like and become a more educated citizen today. Go to hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/course.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scott Bertram.
We continue a series of episodes from presentations delivered at Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence seminars. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offers educators the opportunity to deepen their content knowledge and refine their skills in the classroom. These one-day conferences are hosted during the academic year in cities across the nation and feature presentations by Hillsdale College faculty, K-12 office staff, and leaders in the Hillsdale network of member schools. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series exploring the art of teaching a variety of subjects. To learn more about upcoming events, visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. Great to meet you all. And I'm going to talk to you today about the real founding, in contrast to the fake founding. The New York Times has provided you, of course, with a curriculum to teach what America is really about, the 1619 Project. And I'm be biased about this. I'm actually a subscriber to the New York Times. I'm from New York myself, but it's really just for the crossword puzzle. But the alternative here is the 1776 Project that Hillsdale College put out in the waning days of the Trump administration. In fact, it may well have been the last thing that Donald Trump did as president was to adopt this, and of course immediately revoked by the incoming Biden administration. But I'd like the idea of that because you think of what presidents are doing in their last hours of office is often notable. John Adams is signing the commissions of the midnight judges, signing important acts or vetoing important acts, or Bill Clinton pardoning his political cronies in the waning hours of his administration. So that trend, but one of the points is that the 1776 Project that Hillsdale has provided is really nothing new. We've been doing this for years, for as long as I've been at Hillsdale. I've been teaching constitutional history there for 25 years, and I'm a historian. Professor Carrington is in the political science department, but I learned most of my approach towards the founding from people in political theory, especially. So that's nothing new. And another important thing to keep in mind is that really the 1619 Project is nothing new. In fact, that was pretty, with some exaggerations, right? With some sort of over-the-top extensions. This is the 1619 Project pretty much represents what American university educators have been teaching about the founding since at least the 1960s. The view associated with the New Left, especially. It's the kind of stuff that I read in graduate school. It's very, very mainstream. As a good illustration of that, there's a piece by a historian named Stephen Oakes, who teaches at the CUNY Graduate School, I think, in New York. And he wrote a long article about the 1619 Project's distortions, about the history of slavery in particular. He published this in Jacobin magazine, right? So this is not a right-wing, attack on the 1619 Project. And his complaint was, this is nothing new. It's just been sort of publicized and hyped in a way that the mainstream academy has been teaching for a long time. So I want to give you the alternative view of the American founding and of this issue of slavery and sort of the justice of the founding in particular. And in a way, it's really just a recapitulation of a lot of earlier arguments in American history. You could say that this argument over the Constitution, especially the Declaration, the founders' view of slavery, is really encapsulated in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Really, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are just a long argument between Lincoln and Douglas about what did the founders believe about slavery, right? It's an original intent argument, right? What was the position of the founding generation about this, and therefore, what should our position be about this? And then within the Lincoln-Douglas debates, there really is an argument about whether the Supreme Court's latest statement about this in the Dred Scott case was correct or not. And this, you could say, is the dispute between Benjamin Curtis, the principal dissenter in the Dred Scott case. And there's a couple of times in the Lincoln-Douglas debates where Lincoln says, I can't say it any better than Curtis did in his dissenting opinion, versus Roger Taney, and Stephen Douglas is pretty much defending that position about the founders. Right? This view that the founders believed that their position about slavery and the Constitution should be what our position is. Lincoln and Douglas, and really, frankly, almost everybody at the time of the American Civil War are saying that we are representing the position of the founders. Another way of looking at this is if you did a sort of a matrix and said, sort of asked the question of what did the founders believe about slavery? So you could say the founders believed, B-L-E-V-E-D, that slavery was right or wrong. And then you could say the founders were right or wrong about this, right? So someone would say, well, the founders believed that slavery was right, and they were right about that. Right? This is basically Stephen Douglas's position. The founders thought that slavery was right, or at least maybe not right, but okay, or a matter of moral indifference, right? The founders didn't care that much about it. Stephen Douglas said, I don't care whether slavery is voted up or voted down. Neither did they. They left it to local option, and that's fine with me, right? Or you could say the founders believed that slavery was wrong, and they were right. The founders believed that slavery was wrong, and they were right about that, right? This is basically Lincoln's position and the Republicans' position and sort of mainstream anti-slavery people at the time. Or the founders believed that slavery was right, and they were wrong, right? The founders believed that slavery was right, and they were wrong. This is the position of a radical abolitionist. As Dr. Carrington mentioned, this was Frederick Douglass's original position that he later switched to this position. He got convinced by the sort of mainstream abolitionists. But this would be William Lloyd Garrison, right? These are the ones who say the Constitution is a covenant with death and a pact with hell, and we're going to burn it, right? These are sort of the northern disunionists. And essentially, this is now the, well, let me get to that in a minute. And what would be the last alternative? The founders thought that slavery was wrong, and they were wrong about that, right? This would be the position of Alexander H. Stephens, the first vice president, only vice president of the Confederate States of America, right? In the famous Cornerstone speech where he says, yeah, you know, this country was founded on the idea that slavery was wrong. Jefferson did believe that all men were created equal. And he did intend to include black people in that declaration, but he was wrong about that. And we know better now. And so the Confederate States of America is founded on the cornerstone of this belief of inequality, right? Now, what we've come to today is that the 1619 view of this, and as I said, the view in most of the American Academy, is more or less that this one, the founders believed that slavery was okay, right? But they were wrong about that, right? Of course. But this idea that the founders believed that slavery was okay, the view of the Dred Scott decision, the view of Stephen Douglas, is the predominant one. To give you an example of this, a law professor recently wrote a book about this. His name is Graeber, I think. It's called Dred Scott and the Problem of Constitutional Evil. The basic point being that Taney was right. The Dred Scott decision was the correct decision because the Constitution was evil, right? It was a pro-slavery document. And so, you know, Taney was faced with the problem of how do we, you know, interpret the Constitution in light of the founders' belief that, as Taney said, the framers believed that the black race was so inherently inferior that it was okay to hold them in slavery and that blacks had no rights that white people were bound to respect. That was essentially the view of the founding, right? And I said this is pretty much an uncontroversial view in sort of the mainstream American Academy. So the 1619 Project, although Again, because it got rather carried away, and there were some historians who consider themselves sort of on the left who had to sort of trim some of its more excessive claims, but nevertheless, that really is not an unusual position to take in the American Academy. All right, so I want to give you sort of the alternative view about this, about what I believe the founders had to say about the issue of slavery and what they did about it, especially, not just what they believed and said about it, but what they did about it. Because if one thing is very clear, it's that there was nobody at the time of the American founding who defended slavery as not being wrong, right? Later on, and because of important changes that took place in the early 19th century, there did develop a pro-slavery argument, an idea that slavery was not just a necessary evil, sort of a legacy of our ancestors, we know what to do about it, but a positive good. That really doesn't develop until really after the 1830s. The almost unanimous view at the time of the American founding, and you can see this over and over again in Thomas Jefferson, right? You're probably familiar with some of the many things that Jefferson said about this, that, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever, right? And that it's inevitable in history that these people are going to be free. And, I shudder to think about what's going to happen when they are free. Jefferson's worst fear, the fear of many Southerners, was there would be a race war, right? And the whites would be exterminated. And Jefferson more or less said, and we deserve it too, right? The Almighty has no characteristic that would make him take our side in such a conflict, right? There'd be a race war, the whites would be massacred, and we'd have it coming. That was Jefferson's view about this, right? We have the wolf by the ears, he says. It's neither safe to let go or to hold on, right? Jefferson would have liked to free his own slaves, but he's always in debt. They were mortgaged, and he couldn't, right? But that was very typical of the view of the founding generation. There's nobody who's defending slavery at the time of the American founding as right and just. They'll apologize for it and say, yeah, we're stuck with it. We don't know what to do about it, right? There's no safe way of getting rid of it right now. But you can't find anybody before, in the 18th century, that's making a positive defense of slavery. So that is pretty well documented about what their views or their beliefs about this are. But in addition to this, the founding generation did things about that. And again, this is where I want to get into the sort of anti-slavery acts of the American founding. I should establish some of the different vocabulary about this. First of all, there were manumissions. There's sort of three ways in which you can get rid of the institution of slavery: manumission, emancipation, and abolition. Now, emancipation is when an individual slave owner frees his individual slave, right? This is what George Washington did, right? Of all the founders, he was the one who was sort of the most wide-scale manumission after his death and after the death of Martha, because they were mostly her property that he married into, right? Washington was able to manumit his slaves. And a lot of the Southerners did this. They said, yeah, okay, we recognize the conflict between all men are created equal and the institution of slavery as it exists, so I'm going to walk the walk and free my slaves. There are many who did that. As we'll see, there were more slaves who were manumitted in the South than were freed by abolition in the northern states, which did away with the institution entirely, right? Just because there were that many more slaves in the South, right? And manumission, I should point out, is not something you can just do sort of at will. State laws regulated manumission. States could make it more or less difficult for an individual owner to free his slaves, right? The fear being that if owners just free all their slaves, what are we going to do about all these free blacks, right? So you had to control and limit an owner's power to manumit their slaves. Southern states in the founding era made it easier for owners to manumit their slaves. Later on, when things began to deteriorate, they made it harder to do that, right? So manumission became more difficult as you approached the Civil War, right? The northern states sort of either emancipated or abolished the institution. Emancipation is where you don't do away with the institution, but you free certain classes of slaves, right? The British did this, by the way, on their side. They offered to emancipate slaves who took their side in the conflict. And many slaves did that. They took up the offer and were freed by the British Army for serving in the British Army, right? Often you would reward slaves with freedom, right? Certain groups of slaves, but not abolish the institution entirely. A lot of northern states did this when they did away with slavery gradually, where they said, we're not going to abolish the institution today, but every slave born from this point on is going to be free at the age of 21, right? And that way the institution gradually will disappear as the enslaved generation die off and their children are freed, right? But New Jersey, for example, New Jersey did it this way. Even though people think of New Jersey as a free state, there were still 18 slaves in New Jersey in the census of 1860. They were very old, right? And within a few years, that would have been done away with entirely. But many northern states emancipated and did away with the institution gradually. The most extreme of them just abolished it entirely, right? Massachusetts did this. Massachusetts had a constitutional provision very much like that of the Declaration of Independence, declaring human equality, and the Massachusetts court said that, by its own force, abolishes the institution entirely, right? During the Civil War, of course, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, right? That freed most of the slaves in the rebel states, but it didn't do anything about the slaves in Kentucky, right? Loyal slave states, or those slaves who were already behind Union lines, right? Lincoln, for constitutional reasons, said he didn't have the power to do that. And finally, the 13th Amendment abolishes the institution entirely. But suffice it to say that the founding generation, to one degree or another, sort of attacked the institution of slavery by these devices. So there are manumissions, abolitions, various ways. But the most important thing is that the revolution and the action that the states took after the revolution made slavery a sectional institution. Before the revolution, slavery existed in every one of the colonies. It was kind of taken for granted, right? Again, the people know it's wrong, but nobody's sort of seriously making an issue out of it, except for some real radical Quakers. The first religious denomination to become really anti-slavery was a small minority, right? But the revolution made it an issue. Suddenly slavery is a problem, whereas previously it had just been part of the furniture. And it forced that generation to say, what are we going to do about this? And now you have a line on the map, the Mason-Dixon line, so that slavery is no longer a national institution, it's a sectional institution. And that really is the issue up until the Civil War, is the assumption that freedom is normal, freedom is the default, right? Freedom is national and slavery is local. Slavery is peculiar, right? Or is it the other way around, right? Lincoln's whole argument leading into the election of 1860 is Douglas and the Democrats are trying to flip that assumption. They're trying to make slavery national, slavery the default position, and freedom the local option position, right? I would say that the American founding made freedom the norm, and suddenly the South has to defend its peculiar institution. Again, there were some sort of perverse effects in this, in that the justifications for slavery really didn't have to be made before the American Revolution. Again, people just kind of took it for granted. It was part of the human story. Slavery was a universal part of human history. Now it's a problem that Southern slaveholders have to defend, and they come up with all kinds of arguments to defend it, some based on the Bible, some based on biology, sort of new scientific racism, right? All kinds of defenses of slavery begin to become necessary, and so that over the course of a couple of generations, you do end up with a positive, good defense of slavery in the South. Okay, so we have that. Also, if you look at what the government under the Articles of Confederation did about this, before the Constitution was adopted, the Continental Congress decided that one of the big questions, especially after slavery is abolished, is who are citizens of the United States? Right? And the Continental Congress said, if you're a citizen of a state, if you're a free citizen of a state, you are a citizen of the United States. Right? There's no racial restriction to this. In other words, it includes free blacks. If you're a free black citizen of Massachusetts or any of these northern states, you are a citizen of the United States. Right? Later on, Southerners noticed this and said, we ought to impose a racial restriction here. It's not just slaves should be excluded from citizenship. It's anybody black should be excluded from citizenship. Essentially the Dred Scott position. But the Continental Congress did not do that. Again, the argument that Justice Curtis made in his dissent in Dred Scott, that free blacks were citizens of the United States at the time of the founding, right? They could actually vote in many states. Free blacks could even vote in some slave states. North Carolina allowed free blacks to vote until the 1830s, right? So this sort of recognition of black citizenship at the time of the founding, not just slavery, but also the citizenship issue. Another one, maybe the most important one of all, would be the Northwest Ordinance, right? The first time that the old government had to address the issue of slavery in the territories. That's the issue that brings us to the Civil War, right? In the aftermath of the Mexican War, and what are we going to do about slavery in the territory that we acquired from Mexico, and after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Continental Congress government also abolished slavery in the Northwest Territory, north of the Ohio River. Thomas Jefferson was the one most responsible for this, right? And Jefferson originally wanted the policy to be no slavery in any of the common territories, south as well as north of the Ohio River, right? But it showed you one of the weaknesses of the Confederation government was they didn't have a quorum to approve that position. The delegates from New Jersey didn't show up, right? And Jefferson said, my goodness, future generations, thousands of future people are going to be condemned to slavery because, New Jersey just can't be bothered to show up to the Continental Congress, right? And so he adopted a compromise position where you draw a line on the map or use a line like the Ohio River to settle this issue, and that becomes a precedent for the idea that the national government has the power, can exercise the power of prohibiting slavery in the territories, right? Do this even under the Articles of Confederation. And then what do we do about it in the Constitution itself? This is, you have your handy pocket constitutions? Right? I just want to look at those provisions of the Constitution that deal with the issue. And here again, where Professor Carrington mentioned using the primary sources, using the text of the Constitution as your outline is a good idea. People may have heard things about the Constitution and slavery, but when you actually look at the text, it's a lot more, it'll clarify certain things for us, right? And I should say that basically the point that, here's the question, is the Constitution a pro-slavery document or an anti-slavery document, right? And I'm going to make the argument that it was an anti-slavery document, and you can see that by reading the text, although it ends up, after it's adopted, being administered in a pro-slavery way after the Constitution, right? And what Lincoln and the Republicans are doing is trying to restore the operation of the Constitution to its original anti-slavery purposes. But it is also undeniable that the Constitution did make certain compromises with slavery. That's very clear, right? There are ways of reading the text that we're going to go over in a minute that can say, well, there's no slavery there, right? That the Constitution actually, some of the more radical abolitionists said, the Constitution actually prohibits slavery. The Fifth Amendment, for instance, does this. You can't deprive people of liberty without due process of law, right? But more mainstream Republicans like Lincoln said, come on, you got to read this document in a reasonable sort of way. You have to interpret it according to sort of common sense. We got to recognize that there are compromises with slavery that are in the Constitution. But Lincoln's argument is that the Constitution does accommodate slavery, but it does so only when it had to, right? That the founders didn't concede anything more to slavery than was necessary to bring about the Union, right? That we couldn't sacrifice the whole of the Union for the sake of alienating the slave states, making demands on them that would have destroyed the Union. But Lincoln's argument that the Constitution concedes only what is necessary to slavery, not not anything more than is necessary, right? And that's an arguable point. As a historian especially, I'd be sort of cautious about that and say you could make the case that the founders in the Constitution conceded more to slavery than was necessary. They didn't fight hard enough. They could have gotten more concessions from the slave states. That's possible, both as an empirical, historical question, right? The issue of the fugitive slave clause is especially pertinent here. And it's also an interesting question in terms of political theory, right? How prudent were the founders? How much does the Constitution recognize that the general principle that slavery is wrong, but what do you do about it in the circumstances in which you find yourself, right? Did the founders do the right thing as statesmen? Did they exercise the virtue of prudence in the Constitution in a way that is commendable or not? And again, that theoretical question, along with the empirical historical question, are interesting ones to consider, right? Again, I'm going to defend the founders about this, and I think that Lincoln, by and large, he's been accused of sort of making the founders more anti-slavery than they really were. I mentioned there are ways in which sort of the pro-slavery side of the argument is an exaggeration. There were anti-slavery arguments that were exaggerations as well. And I'll admit, sometimes Lincoln got a little carried away. But on the whole, he was much closer to, I think, the historical truth of the matter than the others that I had up in the matrix. Okay, let's look at the text. First, Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3. This is the 3/5 clause, as it's called. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons, right? As the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, which is usually depicted as saying that the founders believed that blacks were only worth 3/5, 60% of white people, that this was a dehumanization of blacks and thus reflects a pro-slavery bias in the Constitution, right? In fact, the way the math works, it's just the opposite of that, right? If you were an anti-slavery person, that the sort of more anti-slavery Northerners wanted the slaves to count for nothing in the representation part of this, right? Because if they count for anything, you're giving the slave states more representation in the House of Representatives, and that translates into more electoral votes in terms of electing the president, right? So if you're an anti-slavery person, you want the slaves not to count at all for representation. It's the pro-slavery people who wanted it to be counted entirely. It's 5/5, because that would give them that much more power, right? When you get to the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, this is going to flip, right? And the idea that unless you give blacks the right to vote, which people weren't willing to do yet at the time of the 14th Amendment, you're going to have to take care of the fact that these people are being represented without having the right to vote, right? So that's one part of it. The other part is, you'll notice it says representatives and direct taxes, right? Here the shoe is on the other foot, right? If you're going to count slaves for purposes of apportioning taxes, direct taxes among the states, if you're an anti-slavery person, you want them to count for 5/5. That'll give more of a taxation burden on the slave states. If you're a pro-slavery person in the South, you don't want them to count at all for direct taxes. So again, it was a compromise. The Continental Congress government had adopted this 3/5 formula as in an unsuccessful way, as a way of trying to raise revenue under the old government. So this is the way in which we sort of compromise on how much power do we have in Congress and what the burden of taxation is going to be. As it worked out, though, the southern states always had the advantage of the 3/5 clause when it came to the House of Representatives and the Electoral College, and Congress almost never enacted direct taxes. They only did really once. In 1798, when war was threatening with France, a direct tax was enacted. And there was maybe there's one during the War of 1812. And the last one was during the Civil War, right? That's how Robert E. Lee's property got confiscated for not paying the direct taxes, and that's how it became Arlington National National Cemetery. So the South, you say the slave states, ended up always enjoying the benefit of the 3/5 clause and almost never sort of the downside of it, the penalty of it. You see, Lincoln complains about this. He says that admitting new slave states is going to add to this sort of advantage that the slave states have, both in the House of Representatives and in choosing the president, and that we ought not to do that. Lincoln says, I understand we needed to make this compromise initially when the Constitution was adopted, but we ought not to extend it by adding more slave states. There were real consequences for this. I've already mentioned a couple of times the election of 1800, how viciously fought that was and how close it was. John Adams would have won that election had it not been for the 3/5 clause, right? Jefferson's party, the Republicans were predominantly prominent in the South and the southern slave states, and that's what gave them that election. So I said the Southerners continued to enjoy the benefits of the 3/5 clause up until the Civil War. It's not until 1860 that you finally get a party that's able to elect a president without any electoral votes from the slave states. And that more or less is why they secede in 1860, 1861. Their ability to control the government through this advantage no longer obtained. It was a temporary advantage for the South. Okay, Article 1, Section 9, the slave trade clause of the Constitution. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But you can tax them in the meantime, right? So this question about the slave trade. compromise where, again, although this one, frankly, was a division even within the South itself. The border states like Maryland and Virginia, where slavery really was a waning institution, they didn't have any interest in the continuation of the slave trade. This was really just Georgia and South Carolina, right? The states where slavery was actually expanding and growing. And so this compromise was you can continue to import slaves for the next 20 years, and after that, Congress has the power to cut it off. Right? Yeah, controversial, and in the Federalist Papers, Madison says, well, if you're an anti-slavery person, keep in mind that the old government under the Articles of Confederation had no power to prohibit the slave trade. And this limited power is at least more than you had under the Articles of Confederation. So Madison depicted it as a step forward, an anti-slavery step. But it was very divisive because even people who would defend slavery as, we know it's wrong, but we're stuck with it, are not going to defend the slave trade, right? The slave trade was so infamous, was so barbaric, it was condemned by almost every country in the world. America is one of the last countries to prohibit the slave trade in 1808. I think Spain and Portugal were probably the last. But also look at the language of it, where it says the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. As Frederick Douglass pointed out, and Lincoln echoed this, the Constitution never uses the term slave or slavery. Slaves are always referred to as persons, right? 3/5 of all other persons, all persons that the states which now exist, not future states, may think proper to admit, right? And because it's very explicit in Madison's notes, he says that we worded it in this way because we had these moral qualms about slavery. We didn't want to admit the compromises that we were making. And our hope is that slavery is on its way out. It's a waning institution, and that when it's gone, you can look back at the Constitution and not see sort of the compromises that we had to make at the time. Right? And when 1808 comes, Congress did on the 1st of January, 1808 prohibited the slave trade. The punishment for slave trading was death, although no one was ever actually executed for it until the Civil War began. But that sort of moral condemnation of the institution of slavery, I think, is reflected in this clause of the Constitution. I should also point out that at the time, people thought that if you stop the importation of slavery, that is a death sentence to the institution, right? That slavery depends upon new imports, right? That it won't grow just by natural increase. Now, I don't know why people thought that, because demographically it was clear already that the American slave population was growing by natural increase. But south of the United States, that was not the case. In Jamaica or Brazil, slavery did depend on constant imports because the condition of the climate and the economy in those regions was much more deadly than it was in the United States. Generally speaking, if you were to pick a place to be the slave, the more north, the better, right? This is why there's a threat to be sold south. You'd rather be in the tobacco economy of Virginia than the sugar economy of Louisiana, let alone Haiti or Brazil, right? So people did think slavery's on its way out, and cutting it off in 1808 will help bring about the end of the institution within a generation or two. It turns out they were wrong about that, but that seems to have been what the assumption was. Okay, and finally, Article 4, Section 2, third paragraph. The one that, in the long run, by the time heading up to the Civil War, is going to be the one that causes the most trouble. No person, again, the language of personhood, held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, and escaping into another shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Right? Again, this is really vague and open to all kinds of disparate interpretations. Again, notice the language of personhood, and also held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof. The original draft of this clause was going to be legally held to service or labor. And Madison said, using that word legally makes it sound like there's nothing wrong with slavery, right? This is not in conflict with the natural law, with natural justice. Whereas if you use the language of under the laws thereof, that makes it sound more like slavery exists only because of positive law in violation of the natural law, which was the general understanding of sort of the natural law theorists at the time. And it also says that the person who's escaping shall be delivered up. But it doesn't say by whom, right? It's a good example of teaching your students why they should never write in the passive voice, right? The question of who's going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause was a hot constitutional issue until the very end, right? Curiously, it's in Article 4 of the Constitution, which is often referred to as the comity part of the Constitution. This is about what the states owe to one another, right? It's not in Article 1 where Congress's powers are enumerated. There's no provision that says Congress shall have power to enact a fugitive slave law, right? It has to be inferred from this, and many people, mostly anti-slavery people, said Congress has no power to enforce this clause. It's up to the states to honor their constitutional obligations and return the fugitive slaves, right? And so there was a lot of argument about this. Congress did pass a Fugitive Slave Act in 1793, and at that point, most northern states were willing to cooperate and recognize this constitutional obligation. Over the course of time, they stopped doing that. Both sides became less willing to recognize the institutions of the other side. Comity, as it's called, began to break down. So that you had open defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, especially, by the time you get to the It's not just the Southerners who are claiming that they can nullify federal laws that they think are unconstitutional, right? John C. Calhoun in the story of the tariff, you know all about that. Northern anti-slavery states like Wisconsin said that we can nullify the Fugitive Slave Act and free people who are taken prisoner under its provisions, right? And they were doing this on the eve of the Civil War. So both sides are sort of heading towards lack of comity, lack of accommodation with one another. If you look at Lincoln and Lincoln's addresses about this on the eve of the Civil War, Lincoln still sounds like the founders. Lincoln famously says, I'm not condemning the Southern people. Lincoln says, they are just as we would be if we were in their situation, right? Lincoln understands and sympathizes with the difficulty that the Southern slave states have because the institution exists among them. But fewer and fewer people take that position by 1860. Lincoln's one of the dwindling minority of people who still talk the way that the founders did about this, who's still willing to go along with comity. Okay? Anyway, those are the parts of the Constitution that have to do with slavery. There's a few others. For instance, Article 5, the amending clause, where it says, essentially, you cannot amend this, right? Because Georgia and South Carolina knew that, okay, if we ratify this Constitution, the overwhelming animus against the slave trade can mean you can amend this protection away, right? So they get an absolute, unamendable guarantee for 20 years on that, right? Article 4 also says that the federal government will, on the one hand, guarantee to every state a Republican form of government. And some anti-slavery people said, that's the end of slavery. Slavery is incompatible with Republican government, and so Congress has to do something to do away with it. It also says that it will protect the states against domestic violence, by which the understanding was it's about slave rebellion, it's not about wife beating, as we use that term today, right? And so the Southerners can claim that was a pro-slavery protection of slavery, right? So again, those are the compromises that the founding generation made about this. We can talk about this some in the Q&A. I just want to say briefly in conclusion, what happened to it? How was a basically, fundamentally anti-slavery constitution, how did it become administered in a pro-slavery way? And the best book about this is by a historian, one of my favorite historians, named Don Fehrenbacher. The book is The Dred Scott Case. And it's not just about the Dred Scott case. It's really about every political, legal, constitutional aspect of the slavery controversy from the beginning up until the Dred Scott case. It's a very, very handy book. It was also published in an abridged version, right? And that's his argument, was that Lincoln is more or less, he's a lot closer to the historical truth than Tawney is, than Stephen Douglas is, right? That you did have an anti-slavery constitution that is administered in a pro-slavery way, right? And the question is, why did this happen? The answer to this, the most fundamental reason for this is the cotton gin in 1793, right? That's a game changer. That changes the economic basis of slavery. That makes it profitable for slavery to extend from the sea islands and the coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina into the vast interior of the United States, right? And that alone probably would have accounted for this falling away from the anti-slavery spirit of the founding generation. Just because so much money is involved, slavery becomes so much more lucrative, so much more profitable. People who believed that slavery was an economically obsolete institution in 1787, that it's fading away, it's going to be gone within a generation or two, there was plausible reason to believe that. But the cotton gin changed all that, right? This technological change. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that Lincoln says in 1860, we can't compromise any more about this, right? One of the assumptions was in 1860, we're all talking about slavery in Kansas or Nebraska. There's not going to be any slavery in Kansas or Nebraska. You can't grow cotton there, right? This is the great American desert. It's just not suitable to slavery. Nature will keep slavery out of the territories, people said. So let's not fight about this politically. And Lincoln said, don't forget, that's what the founders thought about slavery, and things changed. The cotton gin led to the invention, gave slavery a whole new lease on life. So that was one. Another one was the French Revolution, and especially the race war that ensued as the slaves of French colonies, especially Santo Domingo or Haiti, following on the heels of the French Revolution, right? In other words, the Americans say, all men are created equal, life, liberty, and property, all that. And the French revolutionaries do the same thing, liberty, equality, fraternity. Their slaves in Haiti take that idea seriously, and there's a race war, and all the whites in Haiti, which were very few, by the way. One of the unique things about slavery in the United States was we were the only major slave society in which whites were a majority overall. Most slave societies, you had an overwhelming majority of black slaves, a small number of mixed race and white people, usually about 10% of the population. And they're all killed or exiled, and they come to Savannah and Charleston, and they tell the stories about what happens when the slaves hear that all men are created equal. And a lot of Southern slaveholders say, well, let's stop saying that, right? You don't hear Jefferson even using the same kind of, sort of bold, courageous anti-slavery language that he came up with, for example, in his draft of the Declaration of Independence. There's a sort of a chill in the South because of the race consequences of the French Revolution. Right? So that's another one. There was a brief slave rebellion, Gabriel Prosser's rebellion in Virginia in 1800, about this same time. So Southern whites become a lot more scared and skittish about their commitment to the principles of the founding. And another one, in some ways, is the most important of all, just about the same time in 1800, is the beginning of the Second Great Awakening in America, right? A religious revival movement in which the new and rapidly growing denominations of evangelical Protestants take up anti-slavery as one of their causes. Previously, it had been just the Quakers, a very fringe sort of group within the American ecclesiological world, but now it becomes mainstream. And Northern religious opinion begins to move in a very anti-slavery direction. Again, this is a part of the Hillsdale College story. We were founded by Free Will Baptists, right, who were one of the proliferation of denominations that come out of the Second Great Awakening. Very ardently anti-slavery, and Hillsdale sent more of its students to go off and fight for the Union in the Civil War than any other college, proportional basis. So when slavery now becomes a religious and moral issue in a way that it hadn't been before, right? An endless argument about what the Bible says about slavery and what is God pro or anti-slavery, right? There's actually more argument about that than there were about the constitutional issues before the Civil War, right? That made it much more difficult to come to any kind of political accommodation about this, right? It's sort of like the abortion issue today. It becomes a matter of moral absolutes, and when people can no longer sort of accept political compromises because of their moral and religious views about the issue, that alone was probably enough to send us toward the Civil War. You've often heard it said that your politics is downstream of culture. Well, when slavery became a religious, cultural, moral issue, starting in 1800 and probably becoming irreconcilable by about 1830, right? Then the compromises that went into the Constitution became much less useful, much less workable. The South becomes a lot more defensive about this. They begin to insist upon constitutional rights that previously they would have been able to negotiate about and to compromise about. So the issue becomes morally and religiously irreconcilable by a couple of, within a generation or two of the founding.
If you enjoyed this lecture, we encourage you to visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu, for additional information on upcoming Hoogland Center events and other free resources for educators.